All right, let's go. Number 12. The Vede Ash Eruptions. Approximately 12,000 years ago, as the last ice age loosened its grip on the northern hemisphere, the volcanic systems of Iceland's Katla region tore open and vomited fire into a frozen sky. This was not a single vent hissing steam into the cold. It was a catastrophic release of ash and pulverized rock, hurled into the upper atmosphere and caught by the prevailing winds that sweep east across the North Atlantic. Within days, that ash was no longer over Iceland. It was falling on Norway. It was falling on Scotland. It was drifting down across the bogs and tundra of a northern Europe still recovering from the retreat of the glaciers. The ash itself was extraordinary. When magma of a certain composition is blasted skyward and cooled almost instantly in the frigid air, it does not become soft powder. It becomes glass. Microscopic shards of volcanic glass, jagged and translucent, rained across thousands of kilometers of landscape and settled into the mud, the peat, and the accumulating layers of ice. There they remained, sealed away from decay, waiting. For the people living beneath that darkening sky, the eruption arrived as a slow poisoning of the world they depended on. These were Ice Age foragers, small bands who survived by reading the land with total precision. They knew where the reindeer migrated. They knew which lakes held fish, which slopes held berries, which valleys sheltered game through the killing months of winter. And then ash fell across all of it. Vegetation choked beneath a gray blanket. Grazing herds moved or died. Water sources fouled. The delicate ecosystems that these communities had built their entire existence around were disrupted in a single season, and there was no reserve, no stockpile, no infrastructure to fall back on. When the land failed, the people who read it had nothing left to read. But here's where the story turns strange. Those same glass shards that devastated a Stone Age world became, thousands of years later, one of the most precise tools archaeologists possess. The Katla eruption that produced this deposit was chemically distinct, its glass carrying a signature that can be identified under a microscope and matched across enormous distances. Scientists named the layer the Vede Ash after the Norwegian site where it was first identified, and it now functions as a chronological timestamp buried in the earth itself. Consider what that means. A researcher drilling into a Norwegian bog, a Scottish loch, or a Greenland ice core can locate this thin line of volcanic glass and know with confidence that everything above it is younger and everything below it is older, all synchronized to a single moment, roughly 12,000 years in the past. One eruption, one instant of atmospheric catastrophe, now stitching together the archaeological record of an entire continent. The truly unsettling aspect is the contrast. For the foragers who lived through it, the Vede Ash was an ending, an invisible force that darkened the sun and starved the land they knew. For us, it is a bookmark, a clean horizontal line in a sediment core. Their catastrophe became our calendar. The people who suffered beneath that falling glass are gone, their names and their languages erased, but the ash that helped destroy them still lies in the ground across northern Europe, glittering faintly under the microscope, patient and permanent. Number 11. The Burkel Crater Impact. Roughly 5,000 years ago, at the same moment the first cities of Mesopotamia were learning to write and the pharaohs were consolidating power along the Nile, something may have fallen out of the sky and struck the southern Indian Ocean. No one saw it. No coastal people who witnessed it left a record we can read. But if the hypothesis holds, the object that struck the water that day generated a wave unlike anything in human memory. The evidence, if it is evidence, is written into the coastlines themselves. Along the shores of southern Madagascar and parts of Australia, geologists have documented enormous wedge-shaped sand deposits called chevrons. These are not ordinary dunes shaped by wind. They are V-shaped formations, some rising hundreds of feet tall, their sharp points aimed inland like arrows fired from the sea. Some contain marine microfossils and deep ocean sediment lifted from the seafloor and flung far above the tide line. Material that had no business being on dry land at all. A team of researchers working under a loose collaboration called the Holocene Impact Working Group proposed an explanation. The chevrons, they argued, were carved by mega-tsunamis, not storm surges, not gradual coastal drift. Walls of water hundreds of feet high, driven inland with enough force to reshape the land in a single afternoon. And the source they identified sat on the floor of the Indian Ocean, southeast of Madagascar, nearly 4 kilometers below the surface. A depression roughly 30 kilometers wide. They named it Burkel Crater. The implications are staggering. If a comet or asteroid struck the deep ocean 5,000 years ago, the resulting wave would have radiated outward across the entire basin, striking the coasts of Africa, Arabia, India, and Southeast Asia. Every low-lying settlement in its path would have been annihilated. Whatever fishing communities lived along those shores, whatever villages had gathered where fresh water met the sea, would have been consumed in minutes, their existence erased before it could ever be recorded. But here's where the hypothesis fractures. Burkel Crater has never been formally confirmed as an impact structure. It has not been drilled. It has not been sampled. No one has recovered shocked minerals or melt glass from its floor. The fingerprints an impact leaves behind. Many geologists argue the chevrons are simply wind-formed dunes, shaped over millennia by prevailing currents of air, not water. The marine fossils, they counter, can be explained by ordinary processes. The crater on the seafloor may be nothing more than a natural feature of a restless ocean bottom. The debate remains unresolved, and that is what makes it linger. Because scattered across nearly every ancient culture that ringed that ocean is the same haunting story. A great flood, a wall of water that swallowed the world, a handful of survivors who watched everything they knew disappear. The flood myths of the ancient Near East, of India, of coastal Africa, all describe the same catastrophe from different shores. The Burkel hypothesis offers a disturbing possibility that these were not metaphors, that somewhere in humanity's deep memory sits the record of a single real morning when the sea rose up and took everything. We may never know. The crater sits in darkness 4 kilometers down, unsampled and silent, and the chevrons stand along the coastlines, pointing inland, aimed at a moment no living person witnessed and no instrument recorded. Number 10. The Laacher See eruption. Approximately 13,000 years ago, in what is now the Eifel region of western Germany, the earth split open and hurled a mountain into the sky. There is no romance to the name today. Laacher See is a placid lake, a circular sheet of blue water ringed by forest, popular with hikers and pilgrims to a nearby medieval abbey. Tourists picnic on its shores. Few of them understand that they are sitting inside the mouth of a supervolcano. The lake is not a lake in the way most lakes are. It is a caldera, the collapsed throat of an eruption so violent it emptied a magma chamber and left the ground above it to sag into the void. The water is simply what filled the wound, and beneath that water, carbon dioxide still bubbles up from the depths, a reminder that the system underneath the Eifel is not dead. It is sleeping. When Laacher See detonated, it expelled an estimated 6 cubic kilometers of magma and ash. The column punched into the stratosphere. Debris fell across a swath of the continent, stretching from the Alps to Scandinavia, a footprint spanning hundreds of thousands of square kilometers. Ash reached what is now Italy in the south, southern Sweden in the north, and Russia in the east. In the region immediately surrounding the vent, the fallout buried the landscape under meters of pumice, choking rivers, smothering forests, and rerouting the Rhine itself into a temporary lake. This was Central Europe, not a remote island, not an empty basin, the heartland of the continent, and people were there, the late Paleolithic hunters of the European plain, Mobile bands who followed reindeer and horse across the tundra at the end of the last ice age lived directly in the path of the ashfall. Archaeological evidence points to a striking pattern in the aftermath. Settlement sites downwind of the eruption show disruption and abandonment, while regions to the north and west, spared the worst of the fallout, show continuity. Some researchers have proposed that the eruption fractured these hunting populations, severing groups from one another and reshaping the human geography of a continent in a single season. But here is where the Laacher See eruption becomes genuinely useful to us, and genuinely humbling. The ash it flung across Europe did not simply vanish into the soil. It settled into lake beds and bogs and peat, forming a thin, glassy layer of volcanic shards with a chemical fingerprint unlike anything else. Geologists call this a tephra layer. And because the eruption happened everywhere at once, that layer is the same age everywhere it appears. It became a timestamp, a single horizontal line drawn across the archaeological record of an entire continent, allowing researchers to synchronize sites separated by 1,000 kilometers, to say with precision that this hearth in Germany and that camp in Poland burned in the same era. A catastrophe that scattered ancient hunters became, thousands of years later, the very tool we use to measure the world they lost. That is the quiet horror of it. The dust that erased their homeland is the reason we can date its erasure at all. The volcano is still there, still charged, still breathing carbon dioxide up through the water. The people who once tracked reindeer across its slopes are gone, and the lake that drowned their world sits calm in the sun, waiting. Number 9. The Black Sea Flood. The deluge that may have birthed humanity's oldest story. In 1997, marine geologists William Ryan and Walter Pittman at Columbia University's Lamont Doherty Earth Observatory published a hypothesis that would tie ancient geology to the flood myths carved into the foundations of human memory. Their proposal was simple in outline and terrifying in scale. Approximately 7,600 years ago, the rising Mediterranean Sea breached the narrow land barrier at the Bosphorus and poured into a freshwater lake sitting far below sea level. The lake became the Black Sea, and the people who lived along its shores watched their world drown. The setting matters. Before the flood, the Black Sea was not a sea at all. It was a freshwater lake, its surface hundreds of feet below the level of the Mediterranean, its shorelines fringed with fertile lowland. This was prime territory during the early Neolithic. Semi-arid regions surrounding a freshwater body offered exactly what early farmers needed: water for crops, soil enriched by lakeside deposits, predictable seasons in a landscape that had been stable for generations. Communities cultivated these shores. They built permanent structures. They buried their dead in ground they believed would remain. Then the barrier broke. The evidence lies beneath the modern seabed. Sonar surveys have mapped ancient shorelines preserved deep below the current surface of the Black Sea. Drowned beaches marking where the freshwater lake once ended and dry land began. Sediment cores tell the rest. Below a certain boundary, the deposits are fresh water. Above it, they are marine. The transition is abrupt, a sharp line in the geological record suggesting the change did not creep across centuries, but arrived in a rush. Something transformed a freshwater lake into a saltwater sea in a period too brief for gradual adaptation. But here's where the standard explanation becomes genuinely disturbing. Ryan and Pittman's models suggested the flooding was catastrophic. Saltwater cascaded through the Bosphorus Channel with enough force to carve a gorge into the underlying rock. The lake's surface rose day after day. Shorelines retreated across the flat northern basin at rates that would have been visible to the people watching. Fields flooded. Homes flooded. The burial grounds where their ancestors lay slipped beneath rising water with no way to stop it and nowhere along the shore to retreat. The Neolithic communities living on those shores were displaced by a force they could not have comprehended. They had committed their existence to the assumption that the lake would stay where it had always been. The lake did not stay. What makes the Black Sea flood particularly haunting is not only what it drowned, but what it may have left behind in the human imagination. Ryan and Pittman proposed that this event could be the real-world root of the flood myths found across the ancient Near East. The Epic of Gilgamesh, the story of Noah's Ark, narratives of a world consumed by water, passed down through cultures separated by centuries and hundreds of miles. If the hypothesis holds, then the memory of that day survived long after the shorelines vanished, encoded not in stone, but in story. The debate over the flood's speed continues in journals and conferences to this day. Some argue it was gradual. What remains undisputed is the fundamental change. A freshwater lake became a saltwater sea. People lived on the shores that are now submerged, and whatever they built, whatever they believed, the water took it all, and preserved only a rumor. Number 8. The Lake Agassiz outburst floods. In what is now central Canada, at the retreating edge of the last great ice age, meltwater pooled behind a wall of ice into a body of water so vast it has no living equivalent. Lake Agassiz. At its peak, it covered a larger area than all of the modern Great Lakes combined. A freshwater sea sprawling across the heart of a continent, held in place by nothing but a dam of glacial ice that was already beginning to fail. For thousands of years, the Laurentide ice sheet had functioned as a barrier, trapping the meltwater from its own slow death. As the climate warmed, that meltwater accumulated faster than it could escape. The lake grew and grew. It swallowed the flat interior lowlands of North America until its surface stretched beyond the horizon in every direction, a shallow inland ocean sitting on the roof of the world, waiting. Then the ice gave way. Not once, repeatedly. Between roughly 13,000 and 8,200 years ago, the barriers holding Lake Agassiz collapsed again and again, each failure releasing an outpouring of fresh water on a scale that defies ordinary comparison. These were not floods in any sense a human being could recognize. When the ice dam broke, the lake emptied through the breach with a force that carved massive channels into the bedrock, scouring valleys still visible across the Canadian and Northern American landscape today. The total volume released across these events exceeded the amount of water held in every lake on Earth right now. An entire freshwater sea drained into the ocean in geological instants. The early peoples scattered across North America lived downstream of this. Nomadic hunting bands following game across the post-glacial plains occupied a landscape that could be reshaped without warning, where river systems shifted course, where valleys that had been dry for a season could fill and rage. The floods rewrote the geography they depended on. Hunting grounds, migration routes, the reliable waterways that structured their movement across the continent, all of it subject to sudden violent revision by a lake collapsing hundreds of kilometers away. But here is where the outburst floods become something far larger than a regional catastrophe. When that volume of fresh water poured into the North Atlantic, it did not simply raise the sea, it diluted it. The dense, salty water that drives the great ocean currents, the conveyor that carries warmth northward and keeps the northern hemisphere temperate, depends on a delicate balance of salinity. Flood that system with glacial fresh water, and the entire circulation stalls. The implications are staggering. A single lake, bursting through a wall of melting ice in central Canada, could reach across an ocean and switch off the machinery that regulates the planet's climate. Growing seasons shortened. Temperatures across the northern hemisphere dropped. Communities that had never seen Lake Agassiz, never stood on its shores, never known it existed, felt its death throes in colder winters and failing food supplies thousands of kilometers away. The channels are still there, cut into the stone, dry now and silent, tracing the paths where more water than exists in all the world's lakes once tore toward the sea. They remain as the only monument to a body of water that helped freeze a warming world, and the mechanism it revealed, the fragile thread of salt and current that holds our climate steady, has never stopped being fragile. Number 7. Post-glacial sea level rise. Between roughly 20,000 and 7,000 years ago, the great ice sheets that had locked up the world's water for tens of thousands of years began to melt. This was not a single flood. It was not a wave. It was the slow, patient drowning of the human world. As the glaciers retreated across North America, Scandinavia, and northern Asia, the water they released had to go somewhere. It went into the oceans, and the oceans rose. They rose approximately 120 meters. That number is difficult to hold in the mind, so consider what it means on the ground. A rise of 120 meters is the height of a 40-story building. Every coastline on Earth, every beach, every river mouth, every sheltered bay where humans had gathered shellfish and fished the shallows and built their fires was pushed inland by that rise. Not a little. Not in a few places. Coastlines where humans lived were permanently submerged worldwide. The truly unsettling aspect is where those people actually were. During the Ice Age, the coast was not where it is now. Enormous stretches of land that are today ocean floor were once dry, fertile, and inhabited. In Southeast Asia, a vast lowland plain called Sundaland connected the islands of Indonesia, Malaysia, and Borneo into a single continental landmass larger than India. People walked across it. They hunted across it. They lived across it for thousands of years. On the far side of the planet, Beringia stretched between Siberia and Alaska, a cold grassland corridor that carried the first peoples into the Americas. Both of them are gone. Sundaland lies beneath the shallow waters of the Java and South China Seas. Beringia lies beneath the Bering Strait. Two homelands, each larger than modern nations, swallowed by the rising water and erased from the map as if they had never existed. But here's where the loss becomes genuinely disturbing. These were not empty lands. When marine geologists and archaeologists survey the continental shelves that were once dry, they find the evidence directly. Stone tools and hearths now lie on continental shelves underwater. The charred remains of fires that people lit, the flint they knapped, the everyday debris of ordinary lives, all of it sits in the dark on the seafloor, meters or hundreds of meters below the surface, exactly where it was left when the water came. And the water came slowly. That is the horror of it. This was not a catastrophe that killed in an afternoon. It was a catastrophe measured in generations. A child born on the coast of Sundaland would live and die on land that was already narrower than it had been at their birth. Their grandchildren would fish over ground where their ancestors had walked. The sea advanced a few meters in some years, and in others it surged forward in sudden pulses as distant ice dams failed. Nobody chose to leave. The land simply stopped being land. Whatever those drowned peoples knew, whatever they built, whatever paths they walked between one shore and another, is now inaccessible beneath the waves. We know they were there because their tools rest on the seabed. We know almost nothing else. The largest homelands humanity has ever lost do not appear in any legend. They lie in silence on the bottom of the sea, and the water that took them has never given anything back. Number 6. The Storegga Slides. In 1931, a British fishing trawler working the North Sea between England and Denmark hauled its nets from the water and found something that should not have been there. Tangled among the fish and seaweed was a lump of peat, and embedded within it was a barbed antler point, a tool shaped by human hands. It had been dredged from the seafloor, dozens of meters below the surface of the open ocean. Humans had lived on land that was now beneath the waves. That land is called Doggerland. During the last ice age, when sea levels sat far below their modern position, the North Sea basin was dry ground, a vast plain of marshes, forests, and river valleys stretching from eastern England to the coasts of Denmark and the Netherlands. This was not marginal territory. Mammoth, aurochs, red deer, and wild horse roamed its lowlands. Rivers teemed with fish. Mesolithic hunter-gatherers thrived there for thousands of years, moving across a homeland larger than many modern European nations. It was a real lost world, populated, productive, and entirely erased. By approximately 8,200 years ago, rising seas had already whittled Doggerland down to a low-lying archipelago of islands and marshland. Its people were among the most vulnerable populations on Earth. Low elevation, no high ground to flee to, surrounded on all sides by water that had been consuming their world for generations. Then, off the coast of Norway, the seabed gave way. A section of the Norwegian continental shelf, the size of a small country, detached and slid into the deep ocean. The Storegga slide, as geologists came to call it, displaced an enormous volume of sediment, a mass of earth collapsing into the Norwegian Sea in minutes. The result was one of the most powerful tsunamis in the geological record of the North Atlantic. Waves reached estimated heights of 25 meters along the Norwegian coast. Sediment deposits carried by the wave have been traced tens of meters above modern sea level on the Shetland Islands and far inland across eastern Scotland. Sand left in places the sea should never have reached. But here is where the event becomes genuinely disturbing. Submarine landslides give no warning. No earthquake preceded it that anyone on land could have felt. The ocean floor simply failed, and minutes later, a wall of water was racing across the North Sea at speeds approaching those of a jet aircraft. The remnants of Doggerland, barely rising above the waterline, had no framework for understanding why the sea suddenly stood 20 meters tall and came screaming toward them. When the wave reached the archipelago, the effect was total. A landscape that had already been drowning for millennia received its final blow. After this moment, whatever traces of human habitation had clung to the Doggerland remnants effectively vanish from the archaeological record. The Storegga tsunami did not merely flood a coastline. It delivered the killing stroke to a dying world, sweeping away its last inhabitants in a single afternoon. We know they were there because their tools still surface. To this day, fishermen working those waters dredge up mammoth bones and Mesolithic stone implements from the seabed, artifacts of a people whose names, languages, and understanding of their world are gone. Doggerland is not lost in the sense that we forgot it. It is lost in the sense that the ocean physically consumed every trace of the ones who called it home. Number 5. The 4.2 kiloyear event, the drought that killed 3 worlds at once. In 1993, geologist Harvey Weiss at Yale University published findings from his excavations at Tel Leilan in northeastern Syria that connected a single climatic shift to the collapse of civilizations separated by thousands of kilometers. His team had uncovered a thriving urban center, part of the Akkadian Empire, the first true empire in human history, abruptly abandoned around 2200 BCE. The soil told the story. Beneath the abandonment layer lay the remains of a prosperous city. Above it, centuries of wind-blown dust. No fire, no siege, no slaughter. The inhabitants simply left, and the desert moved in. What Weiss proposed was radical. The Akkadian Empire, stretching from the Persian Gulf to the Mediterranean, did not fall to invasion or revolt. It was destroyed by drought. Around 2200 BCE, a severe aridification event settled over the northern hemisphere and refused to lift. Rainfall collapsed across the fertile heartland of northern Mesopotamia. The cities that depended on rain-fed agriculture could no longer feed themselves. Populations fled southward toward the irrigated lands along the Tigris and Euphrates, overwhelming the infrastructure of the settlements that remained. The empire fragmented within a generation. The most powerful political entity the world had yet produced ceased to exist. But here is where the story becomes genuinely staggering. The Akkadian collapse was only one piece of the catastrophe. The same drought left its signature across the entire planet. Marine sediment cores pulled from the seabed of the Middle East preserve a dramatic spike in wind-blown dust at precisely this period, a mineral fingerprint of a landscape turning to powder. Cave records and lake sediments across the region confirm the same abrupt reduction in rainfall spanning several centuries. Something disrupted the atmospheric circulation of the entire globe, and the civilizations caught beneath it had no way of knowing they were not alone in their suffering. In Egypt, the Old Kingdom fractured. The pharaohs who built the Great Pyramids of Giza, who had maintained centralized authority for nearly 1,000 years, lost their grip on the Nile. The annual floods that fed the kingdom diminished catastrophically. Egypt splintered into competing provincial authorities, a chaotic interval its people would remember as a dark age for millennia afterward. Simultaneously, 4,000 kilometers to the east, the Indus Valley civilization entered terminal decline. The great cities of the Indus Plain, home to sophisticated urban planning and extensive trade. Networks, dispersed as monsoon patterns weakened and the rivers thinned. One of the earliest cradles of human civilization dissolved city by city. What makes the 4.2 kiloyear event particularly disturbing is not its death toll, though the death toll was staggering. It is the pattern it reveals. A single shift in atmospheric circulation simultaneously dismantled civilizations that had no knowledge of one another's existence. The Akkadians never knew of Egyptian suffering. The Egyptians had no concept of the Indus Valley. Each experienced its own destruction as local, as personal, as incomprehensible. None of them understood that the same invisible force was erasing human achievement across 3 continents at once. The drought lasted somewhere between 2 and 3 centuries. Civilizations that had taken 1,000 years to build were undone in a handful of generations. The dust settled over their cities and stayed, and it stands as evidence that the climate does not negotiate with human ambition, that the ground beneath every empire is only as stable as the rain that has not yet stopped falling. Number 4. The Thera eruption, the death of the first great European civilization. In 1967, archaeologist Spyridon Marinatos began excavations at Akrotiri on the southern tip of the Greek island of Santorini. What he uncovered beneath meters of volcanic ash was extraordinary. A complete Bronze Age city, preserved like Pompeii, with multi-story buildings, sophisticated drainage systems, and frescoes of astonishing artistry. The city had been frozen in time by a volcanic eruption so powerful it reshaped the geography of the eastern Mediterranean. Approximately 3,600 years ago, around 1600 BCE, the volcano that formed Santorini, known to geologists as Thera, detonated in one of the most violent eruptions of the last 10,000 years. The explosion collapsed the center of the island into the sea, creating the distinctive caldera that defines Santorini's crescent shape today. Ash deposits from the eruption have been identified in sediment cores across the eastern Mediterranean seabed and in ice cores from Greenland, thousands of kilometers away. The immediate blast obliterated the island settlements. Akrotiri, miraculously, shows no human remains, suggesting the population evacuated before the final cataclysm, likely warned by preliminary seismic activity. But evacuation from the island did not mean survival. But here's where the destruction became continental. The eruption generated tsunamis that radiated across the eastern Mediterranean, striking the northern coast of Crete just over 100 kilometers to the south. Crete was the heart of the Minoan civilization, the first advanced civilization in European history. The Minoans had built palace complexes at Knossos, Phaistos, Malea, and Zakros. They possessed a written language, maintained trade networks spanning the eastern Mediterranean, and created art that would not be matched in Europe for 1,000 years. Archaeological evidence from the northern Cretan coast shows destruction layers consistent with tsunami impact. Harbor installations were devastated. Coastal settlements were wrecked. The Minoan fleet, the foundation of their economic and military power, was likely crippled in a single afternoon. What makes the Thera eruption particularly terrifying is what followed the immediate destruction. The eruption injected massive quantities of sulfur dioxide into the stratosphere, creating an aerosol layer that cooled regional temperatures. For a civilization already reeling from tsunami damage, the years of diminished harvests may have been the blow from which the Minoans never recovered. Within a generation of the eruption, Minoan civilization entered a steep decline. Mycenaean Greeks from the mainland moved into Crete. The Minoan language disappeared. Their palace complexes were repurposed or abandoned. A civilization that had thrived for over 1,000 years was consumed by a culture that had been subordinate to it just decades earlier. The truly unsettling aspect is what the survivors may have carried with them. Some scholars have proposed that the destruction of Thera provided the historical foundation for Plato's story of Atlantis, a powerful island civilization destroyed by catastrophe and swallowed by the sea. Whether or not Atlantis was Minoan, the parallel is precise. An advanced island culture at the height of its power, erased by forces erupting from beneath the earth it stood on. The frescoes still line the walls at Akrotiri. The blue monkeys, the leaping antelope, the boys carrying fish, all painted by hands that vanished when their world exploded. They sit in the ash today exactly where they were left, luminous and silent, the last surviving portrait of a people who did not know they were the first great civilization Europe would ever lose. Number 3. The Campanian Ignimbrite. Approximately 39,000 years ago, near what is now the city of Naples, Italy, the ground itself detonated. The eruption that geologists call the Campanian Ignimbrite was not a mountain venting fire. It was a region of the earth tearing open and expelling its interior into the sky. The explosion collapsed the terrain into a vast depression, creating the Campi Flegrei caldera, the burning fields, a landscape that still simmers with geothermal activity beneath the streets and suburbs of a modern metropolis. It remains one of the most powerful volcanic events Europe has ever endured, and it happened at the exact moment another kind of ending was already underway. The scale is difficult to hold in the mind. Ash and volcanic debris were flung across the continent with such force that traces of the eruption have been identified thousands of kilometers from the source. Layers of Campanian tephra have been found as far away as Russia, buried in soils that record the moment the sky filled with particulate and refused to clear. This was not a regional inconvenience. It was a continental blackout. The eruption injected enough material into the atmosphere to cool the region significantly, dimming sunlight, shortening growing seasons, and poisoning the ecosystems that European populations had depended on for survival. Vegetation withered. Prey animals scattered or died. The temperature dropped across an already cold and fragile world. But here is where the story becomes something far darker than a single natural disaster. Because 39,000 years ago, Europe was not empty. It was home to two human species. The Neanderthals had ruled the continent for hundreds of thousands of years, and they were, at that precise moment, beginning to vanish. The decline of the Neanderthals across Europe aligns with the timing of the Campanian Ignimbrite with an unsettling closeness. A species that had survived multiple ice ages, that had endured cold beyond anything modern humans had faced, that had adapted to the harshest corners of the Pleistocene world, began its final disappearance in the same window that the sky turned to ash. The implications are staggering. This eruption may have contributed to the fall of an entire human species. Not a tribe, not a culture, a species, a separate branch of humanity, a people who buried their dead and made tools and lit fires against the cold, pushed toward extinction as their world darkened and their food sources collapsed beneath volcanic winter. Whatever they knew, whatever they understood about the land they had inhabited for 10,000 generations, was already slipping away when the eruption struck. The Campanian Ignimbrite did not necessarily kill them all. It may simply have been the final pressure applied to a population already teetering on the edge, the shove that turned a slow decline into a terminal one. We are not their descendants. We are the other species, the one that survived. Modern humans were expanding across Europe at the same moment, and we walked out of that darkened world while the Neanderthals did not. Why we endured, and they did not, remains one of the deepest questions in the study of our own origins. The Campi Flegrei caldera is still there, still restless beneath Naples, still capable. Millions of people now live and sleep directly above the wound that may have helped erase a rival humanity. The fields still burn quietly, and they have not finished. Number 2. The Younger Dryas cold snap. Approximately 12,900 years ago, the planet was warming. The last ice age was releasing its grip. Glaciers that had buried continents for tens of thousands of years were retreating. Temperatures were climbing. The world was thawing into something recognizable, something habitable, something that would eventually cradle human civilization. Then, in the span of decades, it all reversed. The warming stopped. Not gradually, not over millennia, but with terrifying speed. Global temperatures plunged. In the North Atlantic region, the cold returned so abruptly that ice cores from Greenland record the transition as a near-vertical drop in the temperature record. Ice sheets that had been melting stabilized and began advancing again. The world that had been emerging from deep freeze was shoved back into it. This period is called the Younger Dryas, and its onset represents one of the most abrupt climate reversals in the entire geological record. The numbers are stark. In some regions, temperatures fell by several degrees within a human lifetime. The recovery that should have continued uninterrupted for thousands of years simply halted. Vegetation retreated. Growing conditions collapsed. And for over 1,000 years, the Earth held its breath in renewed cold before the warming finally resumed. But here is where the mystery deepens into something genuinely unsettling. Something disappeared during this reversal. In North America, the Clovis culture, one of the earliest and most widespread human populations on the continent, vanishes from the archaeological record almost precisely at the Younger Dryas boundary. Their distinctive fluted spear points, found across the continent in earlier sediment layers, simply stop appearing. A people who had spread across an entire landmass were gone from the record within a geological instant. What triggered the collapse remains one of archaeology's most bitterly contested arguments. The conventional explanation points to disrupted ocean currents, meltwater flooding into the North Atlantic, and shutting down the circulation that keeps the northern hemisphere temperate. But there is another theory, and it is far darker. One controversial hypothesis proposes that the Younger Dryas was triggered by a comet or asteroid impact, a cosmic object possibly fragmenting in the atmosphere over the North American ice sheet, detonating with force enough to alter the climate of an entire planet. The evidence its proponents cite is embedded in a thin geological layer found at sites across multiple continents. Within that boundary layer, impact theorists point to nanodiamonds, microscopic materials that form only under the extreme temperatures and pressures consistent with a cosmic collision. They point to microspherules, tiny glass beads created when rock melts and resolidifies in midair. They argue that something struck the Earth at the exact moment the warming reversed, and the Clovis people disappeared. The debate is fierce and unresolved. Critics argue the nanodiamonds have alternative origins, that the extinctions were driven by overhunting, that the climate reversal was purely a matter of ocean currents. The evidence is disputed at every level, but the coincidence sits there, refusing to be dismissed. At precisely the moment the world was recovering, the temperatures crashed, the ice returned, and a sophisticated human culture vanished from an entire continent. Whatever the cause, the effect was total. A recovering world was thrown back into darkness for over a millennium, and the people who might have flourished in that thaw were erased instead. The nanodiamonds remain in the soil. The argument remains unsettled, and the true story of what ended the Clovis world stays buried in a thin, dark layer, waiting. Number 1. The Toba supereruption. Approximately 74,000 years ago, on the island of Sumatra in what is now Indonesia, the Earth produced one of the largest volcanic eruptions in the last 25 million years. Not a large eruption. Not a historically significant eruption. One of the single largest volcanic events in a span of time so vast that it predates the human species itself several times over. The scale defies the categories we use to measure destruction. The eruption ejected an estimated 2,800 cubic kilometers of material into the atmosphere. Rock, ash, pulverized mountain hurled skyward in a convulsion that dwarfs every eruption in recorded human history combined. To stand anywhere within 1,000 kilometers would have been to witness the sky itself catch fire and then go dark. The evidence is still in the ground. Ash layers up to 6 meters thick from the Toba eruption have been identified across India, 7,000 kilometers from the vent. Not centimeters. Meters. A blanket of volcanic debris deep enough to bury a house, deposited across an entire subcontinent, still legible in the soil after 74,000 years. The ash traveled on winds that circled the planet. The material that settled over India was merely what fell closest to home. But here is where the story becomes genuinely disturbing. The eruption did not simply bury a region. It may have nearly ended us. In the years following the blast, sulfur and ash injected into the upper atmosphere would have dimmed the sun. Skies darkened for years. Temperatures fell. Growing seasons collapsed across the entire planet in a volcanic winter that no human alive had the memory or the tools to survive. For decades, a haunting theory has attached itself to this eruption. Human genetic diversity is strangely, almost impossibly low. We are one of the least genetically varied large mammals on Earth. Some researchers proposed an explanation drawn straight from the Toba disaster, a genetic bottleneck. A moment when the human population was reduced to a few thousand individuals. Not a few thousand in one region, a few thousand across the entire planet. Consider that number. Every human being who has ever lived since, every language, every city, every empire, every face you have ever seen potentially descended from a population small enough to fit inside a single sports stadium. The whole of human history balanced for a moment on a group you could count. The theory is now heavily debated. Later evidence suggests some human populations weathered the eruption with less disruption than the bottleneck model demands, and the timing of the genetic constriction is contested. The catastrophe may not have brought us as close to oblivion as once believed. But the argument itself reveals something that does not go away with the debate. We are a species that came within a hypothesis of not existing at all. That is the truly unsettling aspect. The eruption was real. The 2,800 cubic kilometers were real. The 6 meters of ash across India are real, and they are still there, waiting in the earth for anyone who cares to dig. What remains uncertain is only how close the darkness came to finishing us. We do not know how many survived. We do not know what was lost in those darkened years. We know only that our ancestors passed through a needle so narrow that the marks of it are still written in our blood, and that the world they inherited on the other side was the one we would eventually call our own. These 12 events share something worth sitting with. None of them happened overnight. That word is dramatic, but it is a lie. The Zanclean flood took months to years. The 4.2 kiloyear drought ground on for centuries. Doggerland drowned generation by generation as the water crept inland meter by meter. Even Toba, the largest of them all, delivered its killing winter over years, not hours. Catastrophe on a geological scale rarely arrives as a single moment. It arrives as a slow strangulation that no single lifetime could perceive as unusual. And the people caught inside these events were not empires. They were hunter-gatherer bands following game across open plains. They were early farming communities planting the first crops, betting their survival on seasons that had always returned. They had no maps of what was coming, no framework for a sky turned to poison or a sea that would not stop rising. What remains, after every one of these erasures, is a single unsentimental truth. The Earth's climate and geology do not negotiate with human ambition. They do not care about our monuments, our harvests, or our certainty that tomorrow will resemble today. We inherited a world built on drowned homelands and buried peoples, and we have simply been fortunate enough to arrive during a pause. If you want to see more videos like this,